Every one of us forgets something every now and then. So maybe we forget to buy milk when we are at the supermarket. Maybe I forget the name of a person I met 10 or 15 years ago. Or maybe we just forget our password to our email account. But of course, forgetting these things is not necessarily linked to a serious illness, a serious disease such as Alzheimer's or another mental disorder. Two researchers from the Institute of Neuroscience and Medicine, Brain and Behavior, they want to find out more about how our brain is organized and how the organization affects mental illnesses. In the second part of the next presentation, you will hear Dr. Kausthub Patil. He's the leader of the working group Applied Machine Learning. And Professor Dr. Sarah Genon will begin the presentation. She's the leader of the working group Cognitive Neuroinformatics. Sarah, to put it very simply, your research is about how our brain is organized, how it works, and why this organization sometimes doesn't work very well, so why we forget things. What would you say, what is the most important thing you want us to keep in mind and not to forget now when we're listening to your presentation?
That we are all different. In general, but also when it comes to medical condition. And this morning I was talking with my colleague about the fact that different people show completely different symptoms of COVID, but this variability is actually something very general in medicine, and we also have it for brain disorders. That's why we want to develop tailored treatment, tailored solution in our field.
We will hear more about that right at the start now of your presentation. Looking forward to that. It's called The Organization of Our Brain, Tracking Aging and Mental Illness with Big Data and AI.
Thank you. I'm sure you have all heard about Alzheimer's disease. One usually thinks of Alzheimer's disease as soon as one gets old, one has memory difficulties, and medical examinations show alteration in the brain. Indeed, there is one key region which is crucial for memory, which is called the hippocampus, that you see here in red, and that we can find deeply in our brain. So from this point, we might think that Alzheimer's disease is a well-defined and well-known disease, and that all patients show the same profile of symptoms and that they should be treated the same way. During my PhD studies, I've seen hundreds of patients with Alzheimer's disease. I, for example, have met a 60-year-old nurse who had very specific memory complaints. She could not, for example, remember where she parked her car. And she was very worried about these memory troubles. But apart from this specific memory complaint, she had no other cognitive complaints. I also have met a 90-year-old retired professor who also had memory complaints, but his case was not very specific. So he had other type of complaints. For example, he could not concentrate to do several tasks at the same time, and he could not make quick decisions anymore. But I most significantly remember a 60-year-old retired company director who called me every morning during 1 week. So the first day he called me and he told me, "Dear Mrs. Genon, I've seen that you sent me a letter for an appointment for participating in your neuroimaging research about memory. I might agree to participate, but I don't have any memory troubles." After reminding him the context of my letter following his visit to the neurologist, he agreed to participate. But then the next day, he called me again. "Dear Mrs. Genon, I've seen that you have set an appointment for me for participating in your research. But I don't have any memory troubles. I might agree to participate, but really just to do you a favor." Okay, so we talk again together, and of course he agreed to participate. But then the next day, you can imagine what happened. And a week after, it was his wife who called me because he didn't want to try any medication because he had no cognitive problems. For him, it was his wife. She obviously had a problem. So, do you think that these 3 patients should be treated the same way, that they and their close relative face the same problem in their daily life? And if there is one key region for memory, how comes that we have this diversity of symptoms in the patients? To look closer at this question, we took a sample of patients with Alzheimer's disease who agreed to get an MRI scan of their brain. So this gives us a kind of high-resolution picture of the structure of their brain, but in 3D. And what we did is that we look for each location point within the hippocampus, so this dark gray elongated region that you can see deeply inside the brain. And we take a clustering algorithm to identify when there is gray matter lost at this location in the hippocampus, where else is there gray matter loss that we call atrophy in the brain. And so we do that for different points. So the basic idea is that if we take these 2 dots, so the green dot, when there is atrophy there, where else is there atrophy in the brain? And when we see atrophy at this green dot, where else do we see atrophy in the brain? And our clustering algorithm helps us to identify specific association. And what we find is that different patterns of atrophy in the brain are related to atrophy of different parts of the hippocampus. So there are actually at least 2 different brain networks that interact with 2 different parts of the hippocampus. Here, the red network works with the head of the hippocampus, whereas the pattern of blue region is co-atrophied with the tail of the hippocampus. So to better understand then how these different patterns relate to behavioral disorder, what we did is to compare this pattern of atrophy in the brain to the way our brain is activated when we do behavioral tasks. And what we find is that the pattern of red regions actually correspond to a network of regions that are engaged for motivation, emotion, and in general, self-related processing. So this allows us to reflect on who we are in particular. And the pattern of blue regions, in contrast, is related to processing of information from the external world. So this is important, for example, for spatial navigation, but also for learning new information. So this means that there are at least 2 different networks that we can see here. And depending on which network is affected and to which extent, we will observe different behavioral symptoms in the patient. Now you might think then the doctors in the clinic and the researcher, they should just look at the pattern of brain alteration to define specific prognostic and person-specific treatment. Okay, let's look together at a brain scan. This is a 3-dimensional image. It means that we are supposed to look at hundreds of brain regions at the same time. We, humans, can actually do not do that. This is why we need to develop artificial intelligence techniques to identify, to process all this information and to identify the relevant information for individual prediction from this brain scan in order to develop person-specific prognostic and treatment. Now I will let my colleague, Kausthub, tell you more about what we are doing with this artificial technique in the brain, artificial intelligence technique in the brain. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So let's consider one very specific individual prediction problem. It's called the age prediction problem. So imagine you take a 5-minute MRI scan, and the question is, can we find out just simply based on this MRI scan how old this person is? Now imagine we have a big database of thousands or tens of thousands of people with this high-resolution MRI scan and their age. What we can do, we can train an AI method on this. And then the question is, now there is a new person that the AI has never seen, right? We have the MRI scan for this person. How old is this person? Is it somewhere here on this age continuum, or is it here, right? So we actually trained such a method, and here is the outcome, right? So each dot here is one person. On the x-axis is the actual age of this person. On the y-axis is the predicted age by the AI. So we see it aligns quite nicely on the diagonal. That means it's accurate. Indeed, 4 to 5 years. That's the error. But that's not the most interesting thing. What we are interested in, where the AI actually tells us that the brain looks much older than the true age of the person. For example, in this case, the person looks like almost 40 years old to the AI, but the true age is 20. So we can use a method like this to actually spot some kind of atrophy or early aging signs. We know from many, many studies that this is true for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, as well as for many other disorders. Next, we can actually open up this AI and ask the question, how the brain ages, where in the brain the age is actually affecting the most. As we see in this kind of rotating video, is the frontal parts, partly the cognitive parts of the brain, as well as the motor on the side, the red parts, they actually age more. So there is gray matter atrophy happening in these parts of the brain. So how, based on MRI, are we able to tell this? Of course, we use AI, but what is MRI actually giving us? So when we put a person in the MRI scanner, what we get is a 3D image, which consists of a lot of voxels, which is 3-dimensional pixels, and hundreds of thousands of those, right? So what we saw, the age prediction, was trained on what we call as the structural MRI. This is high-resolution MRI images. But as we saw already, the brain regions don't work in isolation. They work together with each other. To find this type of information, what we need is the video of the brain. And this is also possible with MRI. So we take many pictures, one after the other, and that tells us how different brain regions work with each other. Right? And I will show you an example how this can be used. Of course, we need machine learning methods. And I will quickly try to explain why they help us. So traditionally, what is done, let's say we have two groups, young and old, and we try to find where the differences are in these groups. But we already saw there are lots of inter-individual differences. If we zoom in into individuals, we start seeing many different characteristics. And this is where AI can help us to make individual level predictions. We are not interested in so much in the groups, but actually make predictions that are specific to the individual. This is where AI can help us. The second part is with the multivariate patterns. Here is an example. Let's consider basketball players and sumo wrestlers, right? We look at their height and their weight. If we look at them separately in isolation, any statistical method will tell you they do not look different. They are the same. We put them together, we start seeing the differences. So this is a simple example of multivariate pattern. Now, with MRI images, we have thousands of features like this, or even tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of features like this. So AI can actually help us to extract this multivariate pattern information and build predictive models based on that. The final goal is to build generalizable models. What that means is we want to apply the model that trained on certain data to new unseen examples that the AI has never seen before. That's where the real application comes in. Because there are certain challenges also that are associated with that. We'll quickly have a look at them as well. So in general, big data plus AI is perfect. It's a very good recipe to build such a generalizable models. But in some cases, especially clinical cases, we do not have big data. We have only small data. We do not have thousands of examples, but maybe hundreds at best. So what to do in these cases is actually we need to help the AI to focus on very important information. And we have developed a method for this, for example. So what you see in these matrices is what is called as the connectome. So this is what I talked about, the interaction between different brain regions. Right? So this is a whole brain picture, but this is too much for AI to handle, especially because we have small data. So what we do, we ask AI to focus on certain subset of this data. What that means is we build upon decades of knowledge that has been accumulated by multiple behavioral and task-based studies to find out which of the regions that might be useful in this case. And we tell AI only look at those and not to others. So this lowers the dimensionality, right? So this helps the AI to focus on the right information, but it also helps with interpretation to actually find out which brain regions, the interaction between them is actually predictive. Here is an example. We combine this approach with machine learning, so we train AI models, again, to predict unseen examples, so that's the key, right? In this case, then we can make conclusions like the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia can be predicted by social and affective network in the brain, right? Then we can go even one step further and say exactly which brain regions are actually being predictive and the interaction between the brain regions. Yeah? So what I have shown you are two examples based on the structural data and the functional data in two different ways to build predictive models. Of course, there are many other things we can do with this, but the future is actually looking at much more different types of modalities of brain data, combine that with behavioral, physiological, genetic information, as well as to interspecies comparison. So this is going to be the key to actually build clinically applicable individual prediction models. Thank you very much.